In today's lesson, we hear a strange passage which records Jesus' words to his disciples shortly after he's come to Jerusalem. It's near the end of his ministry, and he talks about the terrifying events that will precede the second coming. It'll start with a desolating sacrilege set up where it does not belong. Let the reader understand. Well, what the readers then would have understood when Mark wrote this gospel was the desolating sacrilege refers to the Gentiles, the Romans, invading Jerusalem and getting inside the temple where no Gentile should be. To desolate the temple would be to enter it and pull things down and wreck it. This really happened in 70, and so the readers of Christ's time would realize Jesus had predicted the ultimate religious disaster when God's own house had been invaded by godless Gentiles. When this happens, Jesus tells his listeners, head for the hills. If you see the signs of war gathering around Jerusalem, just get out of town as fast as you can. The end has come, and Christ will soon arrive to begin the final judgment. To our modern ears, these words are unsettling. We don't like to hear Jesus talk about doing mean things and certainly not bringing about the end of the world. Why should Christ's second coming be preceded by so much suffering? Well, there's two things you need to understand about how the Bible understands the end times. First is, God is the source of all life. God sustains the world at all times. That means that God is like the sun in the sky. It's 91 million miles away. It provides the sunlight which makes life possible on Earth. Great. But if the sun were to come closer to the world, the oceans would boil, the mountains would melt, and things would just fall apart. If God were to get too close to the world, in the Bible's understanding, the same sorts of things would happen. God wouldn't cause earthquakes to happen. They just would, because God's presence would be too close to the creation which God has formed. So that's one part of it. The other part of it is that it's not that God's going to make wars break out and conflict and suffering happen, but rather God will wait until humans have messed things up so much that only God can sort it out. In the Bible's understanding, God is the source of all of our teaching about how to be compassionate to each other. And so if the world ignores God's teaching, then the world will succumb to the desire for the rich to just get richer and richer and richer, impoverishing everybody else. And nations will turn on each other, and things will just start to fall apart socially. And it's at that point that God will feel like God needs to do an intervention, as it were, and come in person to sort things out through the second coming. So how do you know if the end is near? Well, Jesus predicts that nations will be at each other's throats, worse than ever before, and the natural world will start to fall apart. When this happens, Christ warns his followers to just get out of Jerusalem, head for the hills. And his sense of compassion extends to those who are the most vulnerable and the most fertile. He explicitly talks about mothers who are pregnant and mothers who are nursing small children. And he says, woe to them because they won't have the strength to run to the hills in time. Well, for the past 2 weeks, the prospect of a worldwide disaster, of course, has been very much in the news. In Glasgow, the COP26 environmental conference has just concluded. World leaders from all over the world had gathered to talk about trying to put into place cuts to greenhouse gases in the hopes of bringing down the amount of heating that the world will experience. Nations have pledged to cut back on oil exploration and coal generation. But as politicians and bureaucrats have negotiated and debated outside the negotiations, protesters have been begging them to do more. Most of those protesters have been children and young people. They've been led by Greta Thunberg, the Swedish teenager who started the Fridays for the Future movement a few years ago. From the beginning of the COP26 conference, she denounced what the world leaders were going to do, saying that they would not do enough, it was too little, too late, blah, 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 in her words. At the beginning of the conference, she predicted the leaders would not do enough. The conference goal was to try and figure out ways for all of the world's nations to make enough cuts so that the overall impact of our cars, our heat generation, our energy generation would lead the world to have an increase in global temperature on average of less than 1.5 degrees since the Industrial Revolution began. Since say 1800, the worldwide average temperature has increased by 1.1 degree. Scientists tell us if it passes 1.5 degrees, then just catastrophic things will become absolutely normal. Crops will fail, famines will happen, disaster will really ensue. Nations have been told that they've got to get their agreements to 1.5 degrees, but the conference concluded yesterday, and experts are saying they didn't meet the goal. Although in principle, they've agreed to try and keep it to 1.5. In practice, the cuts which they have agreed to will probably end up leaving us around 2.4 degrees by 2050, which is unacceptable. So the conference has begged the nations to come back next year to try again. It looks like Greta Thunberg was right. This was progress, but not a complete failure, but still not drastic enough to avoid catastrophe. So this raises a question: how can so many nations with so much scientific evidence in front of them get together and not achieve what is necessary for the welfare of absolutely everybody in the world? This is not a special interest thing. This is for everybody. Part of the problem is that some of the most polluting nations are democracies. Most of our modern Western states lived through the Depression years of the 1930s and World War II. And the promise of post-war democracy has been that citizens would never be asked to make great sacrifices again. No more rationing, no more mass unemployment. Constant economic growth is what gets the leaders reelected now and keeps democracies in place. To ask citizens to make sacrifices is to risk electoral suicide. Yet sacrifice and drastic action is exactly what the protesters outside COP26 were asking for. The younger people are saying sacrifice is the call of the day. And this is where the modern generation gap lies. It doesn't lie in hairstyles or the clothes that young people are wearing, but in what they see as the good life. Kids today are truly different from previous generations. Studies comparing this generation of kids with previous generations have found that there's been a radical shift, particularly among children born since 1995. Kids today spend less time in groups. They spend less time hanging out with each other in person. They don't date as much. They don't drink as much. They don't do drugs as much. They tend to spend a lot of time on their phones. For them, their social life is through their phones. They don't go to movies as much as previous generations did. And they don't go to concerts as much. And they certainly don't go to church as much. They grow up in families with less children, and they spend years longer living at home, often stretching well into their 20s. They're less likely to own a car and much less likely to get a driver's license, especially among city kids. For the generations older than 30 years old, the good life has meant pursuing personal freedom. The freedom to own a house, to live on your own, to have a family. Rock and roll music is full of paeans to the beauty of cars as much a symbol as a practical device for personal freedom. You know, the promise of the open road, rocking down the highway, getting away, right? To go on trips anywhere in the world. Often, adults define a good year by the kinds of trips they took. But to the younger generation, that's somebody else's lifestyle. They don't own cars, and most of them can't afford trips as they struggle to make money laden down with years of student debt and a job market full of part-time positions and unpaid internships. Most youth lack the money to enjoy the carbon-rich lifestyle world leaders are trying to preserve. So the kids are saying no. They're demanding drastic changes to a lifestyle most of them won't get to enjoy anyway. Now, one could object reasonably that, oh, well, the kids who are standing in the rain in Glasgow aren't a representative sample. They're just a bunch of environmental radicals. Good on them, but that doesn't mean that they represent kids today generally. So how do we know what kids today generally want, especially in Canada? Well, fortunately, this year, the federal government provided a way to answer that question. A few months ago, the Canadian government released the first ever State of the Youth report. It was written by youth, about youth. They did in-depth interviews with 1,000 youth across Canada, chosen to represent Canada demographically properly. So rural kids, urban kids, Indigenous people, people of all races. So this is a picture of their steering committee. And if we go to the next slide, that circled face is the face of Jake Bradshaw, who was a member of this congregation. So Jake helped write this report and to do some of the interviews in it. This report reveals that in Canada, youth are deeply concerned about the future. They feel that their views are being ignored by older generations. In the report, it says youth have 6 major concerns. These include leadership, innovation, the environment, reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, and health and wellness. With respect to the environment, here's what the report says that Canadian youth are thinking. And these are quotes. From a youth's perspective, many adults around them do not view the environment as a priority and see it as an obstacle to a flourishing economy. Youth describe being laughed at, discriminated against, or plainly not taken seriously by the older people around them, teachers, parents, professors, etc. In the report, youth call for a drastic change in how we approach climate issues. They called for drastic cuts, an end to the oil and gas extraction in Canada, and that Crown land should be returned to Indigenous people, all of the Crown land. Clearly, the demands of Canadian youth are not the same as the demands of older generations on these issues. This is where we really do have a generation gap. But there's one detail about the report which is fascinating. You know, for the older people in this congregation, if you're in your 60s or 70s or 80s, chances are your generation, on average, started having children in your early 20s. In this report, which is about 100 pages long, not once do the youth talk about raising families. There's nothing in it about raising families or about daycare or about making it possible to raise children. When they are asked about what they cared about, kids didn't come up. The report speaks about the need for better job opportunities, but virtually nothing about having a family. Christ warned that when the desolation comes, it will be a bad time to have young children. Well, in real life, these young people seem to have received the message already. Faced with an unwelcoming economy and environmental disaster, having kids just doesn't seem like a good idea to them. The silence in the report about the next generation is backed up by statistics. Here's a graph of Canada's fertility rate since 1960. That's what it looks like. Since 1960, the birth rate in Canada has plummeted and was made even worse by the pandemic. It's dropped by 37%. 37%. Young women and men are looking out at the world and saying, no, this is no time to be having children. In the scripture today, Christ predicts a worldwide disaster and a time when it won't be wise to have children anymore. That doesn't sound like fiction anymore. The people who are young today will live long enough to see whether all the scientific predictions about the climate were correct. They will live long enough to see if the economy continued to funnel wealth to the few at the expense of the many. They will live long enough to pass judgment on earlier generations, on our generations. For those of us who are older, who love children, and hope that we'll have grandchildren and great-grandchildren, it's not too late to stop the sacrilege that's being perpetrated on this sacred earth. Our politicians probably won't change radically unless they feel push from us. There's still time to tell them to listen to our children. We don't have to hope that God will come down to sort this out. We can do this for our children and for the beauty of the earth.